So, how much of any observed differences between males and females is due to biology? As it turns out, this question is very difficult for a number of reasons, because not only is it tough to sort out exactly the answer to that question, once we do figure it out, and there are ways to figure it out to a reasonable degree, we're left with the question of what do we do with this information? How do we go from a recognized difference to what we should do about it culturally? In this video, the first of several, Nick and I are going to put all of our neurons at work towards this issue, hopefully inviting others to come in and discuss this with us. So sit back, take some notes if you want to, and strap in. It's going to be interesting. All right. So gender, biology, culture, how's all this stuff playing out? The idea for this video has been, I think, a while in the making. And it seems like there's a lot of people talking about this stuff. Honestly, I think people have been talking about this stuff for quite a while, but YouTube provides a perfect environment for people to talk a lot about anything. So here we are. What I was going to do with this video is get into the science of gender differences and see if we can't unpack and tease out exactly what the questions are, what's going into this, why are people getting so bent out of shape over this stuff, and try to figure it out. Right? That's a hell of a goal. It's going to take probably more than one video to do this. Wouldn't you agree?
I would agree. Yeah.
Yeah. So we both got a lot of notes and things to talk about. One thing I do see that's interesting, and I don't know if it's just my own YouTube feed or what, but there seems to be a lot of attention and videos being made about what is going on with masculinity today. Not a whole lot of questions about what's going on with femininity today. Okay, that's kind of a strange observation. I don't know if it's just me or what. That's just sort of an observation. I'll throw that out there. Nevertheless, because I happen to be male myself, I'm probably not going to dive a huge amount into that psychosocial element of femininity because I'm a little bit uncomfortable telling women what to do. But I'll have plenty to say about masculinity, and I think indirectly we might be able to say some things about femininity. But before I say anything else, I want to make it clear that I would love for this conversation to involve women. Mm-hmm. And yes, men can all gather around and decide what they want masculinity to mean. That's great. But this needs to be a conversation because men and women are, in fact, different. And we'll get into the ways that is so. And it's very complicated. And there's tons of overlap. So, all right. But before I dive in, I wanted to know kind of what is your layout for what question are we addressing here, really?
Well, I think to a certain degree, when we were talking about this behind the scenes, it's just we're having a conversation about why there is even a question at this point. Why is this coming to the surface now culturally? And I think that the more and more the question is asked, the more and more, like you said, there's a lot of voices out there, but they're not really saying anything.
Yeah, it's just saying the same thing over and over again.
Yeah. And so I feel like the question is being asked, but also it's so dense now with polarized emotions. I don't think that's actually necessary.
No.
But what exactly is the question we're asking here? Is the question, are there differences between men and women? Yeah, I think the question or the answer there would be yes. But I suppose you said it best already when we were talking, there's no dispute in terms of biological differences of men and women. But I think the question we're asking is, well, does that go into psychology? Does that go into our social interactions, so on and so forth? Where there have been a lot of loud voices that are saying, no, it couldn't possibly inform our psychology. It couldn't possibly inform how we come about developing culture, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Well,
and this is a direct subset of the other questions that we've been talking about already a ton, which is, how much does biology inform psychology? How much does it influence it? Does it determine it? No. Let's get that out of the way, please. It does not. Psychology is not reduced to biology, but it informs it. Right. And this is the exact same thing. So, like, if you happen to be this particular sex, does that have any bearing on your psychology? There are people who would say no. And I would like to go through the reasons why I think that is wrong, but also why it may not mean what you think it means, if you do object to that answer. In fact, one lecture that I gave at Duquesne University, I was talking about this and about the importance of biology for our considerations of the psyche. And one of the questions that was raised was, do you think there's so much resistance to this because of the fact that it must mean there may be also gender-related differences in psychology? And I said, yeah, I do believe that's part of the resistance. But I don't want to just attack resistance with more resistance. I don't want to counter yelling and shouting with more yelling and shouting, right? I know that's probably not going to earn me a ton of clicks because we're in rage click culture now, but I don't care. This is not my day job, right? I'm doing this for fun. So I want to have a sober conversation about this that's rational. So nevertheless, the debate about it, I think essentially here's the question, right? We can boil all this down is, what is masculinity? What is femininity? Those are the questions that we're addressing. One way to address that is, well, where does it come from? Right. And of course, the answers are going to vary depending on who you're asking. Well, it comes from biology, it comes from culture, it comes from psychology, it comes from what you learn. True. Those are all true. And yet that doesn't reduce to any of those either. So where does that leave us? I think in a quandary of like, okay, well, then does it mean nothing? Well, but that's the deeper question. If we figure out how to define it, then what? Because I think what we're looking for is a set of values to strive towards in this particular aspect of a life. If I am a man, then I want to know what is healthy or masculinity about. How can I strive towards that? I remember once I had a conversation with David Rotman of the Young Foundation, a Jungian analyst, and he was the president of the Young Foundation at that time. It's about 10 years ago. And he said that he felt as though for a man's development, he has to understand and engage with the concept of masculinity before he can really engage with a woman on an equal footing. And because before that, you might be in this sort of immature state and not relate as well as you could. And it's a very nuanced thing that he just says there, but if you follow that, it actually makes a lot of sense. The devil's in the details, though. Like, what does that mean exactly? So I think that this debate is a debate over instinct. Because if we have a certain biological makeup, we have certain instincts. Okay, what are they? And we're asking that. We've talked about ad nauseum on the channel. Yes, we have instincts. Okay, but here it's more specific. Okay, you're this kind of person, or you're going to have a separate set of instincts, or at least a distinct set from the other sex. And if we use the distinction that is used sometimes in scholarly discourse, that sex and gender are not identical, but they are overlapping concepts, sex being biological and gender being social. I don't think it's that easy, but it's a good place to start. Then that adds another layer. Like, okay, well, if my gender is X, then what does that mean for me? What should I be doing? See? So it's really all of this boils down to a question of what should I be doing? How do I live a good life as a male or female, as a man or woman or trans or whatever it is. As you mentioned, this does lead us smack into the LGBTQ plus conversation, and I think we have to set the foundation here, and we'll probably be able to get into that later. We may not be able to get to it in this video, though. Mm. Okay, I've done a lot of talking. What are your thoughts so far?
Yeah, what are my thoughts so far?
Right, where do you start, right?
Yeah, where do you start? Well, I think I can only speak to my experience as a 32-year-old man and living in 2023, and you know, you said you had a conversation. I'm sorry, I forget the gentleman's name, David Brotman, and talking about a man has to consider his masculinity before he interacts with a woman. I would say yes and no, right? Because I think that a lot of the issues now are because they're unconscious of the fact that they have ideas about who they should be and unconscious of what they are, right? And I think a direct way of kind of really experientially going out and practically experiencing who you might be as a man or who you might be as a woman is interacting with the other. I think that that's an essential part, because I know I've made so many mistakes when it comes to my interactions with women, but I've learned.
Welcome to humanity.
Right. Well, I remember specifically in the, growing up in the 90s, there was this very kind of, I think that's really my generation of men being raised. We looked at the culture and we looked at what it was telling us to be. And it was a lot of hyper promiscuity and so on and so forth, which no judgment there if that's your lifestyle, by any means. But I just remember almost one day coming to a realization like, oh, this is not working for me as a man. I'm not necessarily happy, or I'm not necessarily in line with myself, so to speak. So I think a lot of it is having a kind of beginning to be skeptical and questioning and testing whether or not what you've been told who you are actually lines up with who you actually are.
Yeah. Well, there's a whole lot going on in that, and what you just there. There's a whole lot going on in there, because I remain convinced that these conversations are, whether they directly address it or not, are orbiting the question of what does a good man do? Essentially, that's the question that we're wanting to answer. And I think it's admirable to say that even though I got the impression that as a man I was supposed to be sleeping around, I chose, and at least felt internally, that that was not the right decision for me. There's still a value judgment in there that can be debated. Is it right to be doing that or seeking that or not? And of course, the fallback in good old US of A, American Western world, is, well, do whatever you want to do, right? Go with right? And there's no answer to this question. But that in and of itself is, of course, an answer to the question. And we're getting into a lot more of that as we go. I would argue that there are some pretty solid reasons not to do that kind of stuff. But that gets people's hackles up, because now, oh, you're telling me what to do. You're telling me what's right. And what's funny is what I see, and just again observing my anecdotal point of view here, is that while at the same time we constantly are going on and on about how we don't want anybody to tell us what to do, we actively engage in these conversations anyway. And it's like, are you really sure you don't want to be told what to do? or would you like to be told what to do just so you can argue with it? And in which case they're just externalizing this inner conflict that they have, turning it into a me versus you thing. Obviously a blind alley, right? That's not going to get anybody anywhere. And again, so just to kind of reiterate, so circling back to this is a question of instinct. Are there masculine instincts, right? And I would say yes. But as soon as you say something like that, you're going to invite the nature-nurture fallacy. So let's just be aware of that. We've talked a lot about that over the course of several videos. Just to reiterate for our 3 fans out there, nature nurture dichotomy says everything that you see is either all nature or it's all nurture. It's all genetic or it's all culture. It sneaks into these conversations when you're not expecting it. Lots of people say, "Oh, I know that's a fallacy," and yet they go on and think that way anyway. Very sneaky. So keep an eye out for that. This is one of the ways this stuff gets politically charged too. And it's because if we have a value system, then that means doing one thing is better than doing another thing. And that naturally leads into all kinds of political conversations. Okay, so then who gets the money? Right? That's what this is really about. Politics is about who gets the money, who gets the power. All right, so that said, we have to start at the beginning. We have to start at first principles foundations. What is sex? Here's a great question. Why is there only two? Okay, now there's intermediate sexes, but there is not a third sex. That's a difference. Okay, we've got male, we got female, we got things that are in between those. They are quite rare, but they're there. But we don't have a third sex. Why not? Any thoughts? This is a basic biology question. Why? Okay, here's an even better one. Why does sex exist at all? Why don't we just reproduce?
There are certain confines in which nature functions, and I think it likes order. It doesn't want too much in terms of it likes multiplicity, but it also likes to be confined in a sense.
That's not a bad answer. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
And that's great. You know, if you don't have a biology background, it's kind of a pretty hard question, really. But it boils down to that. Let's look at the spectrum of life. All organisms, the vast majority of them reproduce. Multicellular organisms reproduce sexually. In fact, there is even sexual reproduction among single cell organisms and even bacteria. It's not obligate. They don't have to, like we do. It's the only way we can reproduce is sexually. As far as I know. So what's up with that? So and it goes all the way down the animal kingdom. That means that we're talking about something ancient, that biology decided in the deep time that this was a preferred method of reproduction to just diffusion, right? Just dividing yourself a million times. Why? Well, we don't know exactly why, but there's a couple of really good contenders, and the biggest one right now, I think, is it is a defense against infections. If we lived in a box and there was no other organisms to contend with, we probably wouldn't need this. But what sexual reproduction does is it shuffles up the genome enough so that a single organism is going to have a pathogen will have a harder time infecting a population and getting everything sick. Okay. So that's the foundation reason why there are two sexes. It's a way to shuffle up and increase variability within a population quickly and easily. It also feeds into adaptation. That's a more complicated question, but feeds into plasticity, but we don't have to get into that. Now, let's imagine for the moment that there's three sexes rather than two. You still have lots of variation, only now in order to reproduce, I have to find two other willing partners rather than just one. Okay, so it's an exponential leap in terms of difficulty, right? And nature needs you to be able to reproduce a viable organism, one, and they need to be enough of them. And typically what that means is we either have species that produce tons of offspring and most of them get killed, or a few offspring, but most of them survive. And that channels a organism one direction or another. Obviously, with humans, we are deeply investing in our offspring, and we have a relatively small number of them compared to, say, like frogs, which have thousands of eggs, or turtles. But they don't do any investing. Okay, now, getting back to the sex question. if you have, turns out that mathematically speaking, if you produce gametes, they can be of different sizes. And you can go, again, two different ways. You can have a small number of large gametes or a large number of small gametes. And the reason why it breaks down this way is because having lots of gametes is good and having huge gametes is good. But apparently producing large numbers of huge gametes is not as efficient as just having the differentiation fall naturally into one of two variants. You have one variant that produces a large number of small gametes, and you have another variant that produces a small number of large gametes. That mathematically speaking, that optimizes the reproductive gain that you get by this shuffling business. So that right there in a nutshell is why sex exists, why there's males and females. Because if anyone says that there's no essential difference between males and females, there is. That's it. That's what it is. Size of gametes. At the most fundamental level. Now, you might look at that and go, well, okay, that's it? That's all there is? Essentially, yeah. But it's not just that, okay? Because those things then have all kinds of consequences that play out. And if I happen to be the variant that has small gametes, right? We'll say male. Then I have different rules that apply to me in terms of whether or not I'm going to succeed in reproduction than I do if I'm the other type. And this is across all species that have sexual reproduction. So what I'm getting at is there's a reason why this essential difference is significant, because each sex is subject to different selection pressures. Now, they may not be hugely different, but they are different. And what that difference of selection pressures does is it drives sexual selection to produce dimorphisms in a particular species. Do you know what I mean by that? Explain. What a dimorphism is? Why don't I explain? Okay. A sexual dimorphism is there's a difference in shape and function of one sex over the other sex. That's it. Plenty of examples you can look at in the animal kingdom. Bears. Right? Male bears are ginormous. Female bears are big and scary too, but not as big. And this is a very common theme in the mammal kingdom, especially. But okay, so then how does gamete size equate with the size of the body of the creature? Why does that follow? Any guess, or shall I explain?
Why does gamete size equate to the size of the creature downstream?
Yeah,
is what you're asking. Yeah. Well, it might have a large part to do with the function of, or the purpose of the animal in terms of selected pressures, fitness.
Exactly. So what a sexual dimorphism tells us is that it's more important for males to be big than it is for females to be big. That's all it really says. Now, we can observe the animal in question and figure it out really quickly. In the case of males, it winds up that competition over mates is what does it. If they actively compete for access to reproductive success, i.e. females, and size matters in the conflicts, which it usually does, then that means that the bigger ones are going to spread their genes more, and you're going to end up with more bigger males. Okay, this gets even more complicated when you get into epigenetic modification, but let's just save that for the weeds. All right, we don't need to get into all that. It's just the general principle here is that if I've got different selection pressures for different genders, or different sexes, I should say, then you're going to wind up with dimorphisms. So then the measure of dimorphism in a species tells us how different the experience of the males and the females are. And by dimorphism, I mean not just shape, but also behavior. If you recognizable differences in behaviors. Eagles, for example, there are dimorphic, but the males are smaller than the females. Okay, and the reason is because in order to get access to the female, the males have to go through this mating dance where they fly and they have to, basically they're demonstrating their agility to their potential mate. And the smaller ones have an easier time with this than the bigger ones. So they're not duking it out and busting each other's skulls. Instead, the competition is in a different arena. And the women are there. The women eagles are not interested in epic battles between the eagles. No, they say, "Show me what you got," right? And they're like, "Nah, you're not agile enough. Get out of here." Now, here's a question: if you so both sexes compete for mates, but so far we've only been talking about the males competing. There is a reason for that, especially in mammals, and that's because in mammals, the female invests a whole lot more biological energy into gestation and giving birth and all that than the male does. So for whatever reason, and this isn't across the board, but in most mammals that is the case. Actually, I think all mammals. So then that means that there's less effort put into reproducing in terms of investment. And often in males where you have this dichotomy in the sexes, it's to the male's advantage to reproduce a bunch of times rather than a small number of times and investing in the offspring. Okay, so now let's circle this back to humans. Like, what in the world does all this crap have to do with me, Dr. G? Like, why are we going off on these tangents? Because it's relevant. It's relevant. We are animals. We're in the animal kingdom. We need to keep that in mind at all times, or else things are going to seem mystifying, or we're always going to attribute it to culture when it has really very little to do with culture. Okay, so if I see a dimorphism, I'm going to start looking at how is the experience of the sexes different. So then that's the question: are humans sexually dimorphic? Yes, of course we are. Okay, then that tells us that there is a difference in the selection pressures, or else that would not exist. Or else, if you're going to claim that we don't, then you have to look at that and say, how does this not apply? How does evolution, one of the best theories known, not apply to us, this one particular fact? Okay, but it does. Now, usually the tactic is to say, well, it does apply, but it doesn't matter. Well, we're going to get into why maybe that's wrong. Okay. As animals go, humans are moderately dimorphic. An example of very little dimorphism, you see in a lot of species of birds, where the female lays the egg, but then both of them invest a lot of time in the raising of the offspring. So there's not a huge amount of difference in terms of the overall behavior that leads to success. But of course, that said, you can say, well, what about peacocks and peahens? There's a huge dimorphism there. That's true. So it all depends on what goes into reproduction. What is required for me to get the prize for males or females? What do I have to win? And then that will put the pressure on you, because if you don't win, you don't reproduce, you die out, you don't exist. All right. So an example of humongous dimorphism would be elephant seals, the usual example you see there. Elephant seals are so big, sometimes when they're mating, they kill the female that they're mating with. But apparently that's still okay because the biggest ones clobber all the rest of them and then massively successfully reproduce. So, but what led to that? If you've got competition, it seems like they would always try that. Yes, but elephant seals, the reason why there's such a dimorphism can be linked easily to their life history. They all reproduce in these small concentrated islands. So there's ample opportunity for intense intermale conflict for mates. And because of the way they're set up, the male that wins gets all of the reproductive success. So it's going to go towards the biggest monster on the block. That's what leads to it. So humans are not like that. Males do not weigh 5 times what the females weigh. Okay, which is what you would see if humans were like that. But there is a difference. And the best data that we have on this suggests that this probably predates Homo sapiens, that this dimorphism is due to inertia from the species that we evolved from. It was so important to those species for the males to be bigger and stronger that we've inherited that. Does this mean that it's still important to reproduction? I don't know. That's an open question. I would say probably, but I'm not 100% certain because there's a whole lot of factors that go into reproductive success, and not just biggest and strongest. Um, Although one of the things that drives it is, and definitely you see this in history of humans, is the rise of the early empires. And the males that were at the head of the charges were massively reproductively successful. I mean, I think I read somewhere that like 1 out of 100 people is descended from either Genghis Khan or one of his brothers on the whole planet. You know,
Yep.
something ridiculous like that. Like that's pretty heavy duty success reproductively. You know, and because of the gamete size thing, females can't do that. They just can't. One male can have 99 offspring in a year, and a female can have one.
Yeah.
So that rate limiting step right there causes one of the big differentiations and selection pressure. There's a whole lot less pressure for women to have lots and lots of partners than there is for men. Okay, so we're starting to creep over into some touchy stuff here. Now, people don't want to hear that stuff, but got to keep in mind, there's a thing in philosophy called the naturalistic fallacy, and I want to bring this up right now. The naturalistic fallacy says this is how nature operates, therefore it's okay. Okay, you see why that's a fallacy? No, that's not what that means. All we're doing is saying these are the facts that we have to deal with. That doesn't have any bearing on the ethical implications. Okay, so if there's a gene out there that makes you more likely to want to rape people, and there are studies out there that suggest that might be the case, as one or many more, probably a collection of them, does that therefore mean rape is okay? No, of course not. Ethics is a separate issue. It's a thing that requires a conscious appraisal, as well as affective judgment, a feeling function. All of that stuff goes into what's right and what's wrong. So that's where we're headed, though. Mm-hmm. Okay, I just threw a wall of text at you. I need feedback here. What do you got?
No, I like no. First and foremost, as you're talking, just like it's again, I'm not I defer all of the biology to you for the most part. I would say I have a rather low level intermediate kind of understanding of it all. But I think from a viewer perspective, it is good to hear all this, because for those of you that are watching, I mean, I think you really do have to get down to the core of why there are the differences that there are, and how that kind of gets into what you just mentioned, the right and wrong, right, of it.
Yeah. That's where it gets tricky.
Yeah, well, and I mean, like I read a paper recently, an evolutionary model for morality by it came out in 2018 by Cosmides and Tooby. And they talked about the kind of moral valency, the values that come out of kind of instincts, and why it needs to be considered. And they pretty much said that, you know, politics today have a tendency to either just say human beings are wholly good and human beings are wholly bad. They're neither, right? And I think that's a really important kind of position to kind of stand from, because like you said, if there is a naturalistic inclination within an individual to just want to rape, it doesn't mean that they should. At the same time, why would the genome select a multiplicity of individuals to have that kind of inclination, and maybe it wouldn't, right? But I do like where, you know, what you mentioned, because I think at the same time there's this, the naturalistic fallacy is just because nature is the way it is doesn't mean it's good, right? But also, just because nature is the way it is doesn't mean it's bad.
It is what it is.
Yeah, it is what it is.
We are responsible for making the final judgment ultimately.
But I think a coming to consciousness with it is, like you said, is very important, especially now. Yeah.
Yes. It's, if I have an urge, which another part of me says is wrong, I better sort that out. I can't just look at the urge and say, well, I'm having this, therefore it's okay. No, that's too easy.
Yep.
Sorry. Because the undercurrent here is that conscious awareness itself is an adaptation, in my opinion. And I remember I was saying this to one of my students the other day. She was a resident. She said, "Wow, that's a hot take."
Yeah.
Like, well, not from my point of view, but I think you can definitely support that with rational argument. And the fact is, I'm with William James on the suspicion that we probably have more instincts than average animals do. We got more space for them. Our brains are ginormous,
Mm.
and that's where a lot of behavioral instincts, at least, are going to originate. Which means, well, then why wouldn't I need conscious awareness in order to sort all that stuff out?
Mm.
And it's our job to be pondering this stuff, right? It's
Yeah.
at least the function of ego consciousness, I think, as well as being a meaning-making organism, right? But that's at the apex of this process, is trying to bring it all in and really come up with an expression of meaningfulness. Okay, but that's getting way ahead of the game here. So we've talked about the fact that differences exist. And before I dive into what those differences actually are and how complicated the question can get, I wanted to spend a second on, again, refining our goal here. Our goal is understanding culture, because this stuff influences culture. Just to use the example of a minute ago, where you're talking about understanding the instincts and evolutionary morality. Lions, for example, if a lion comes in and defeats the current male of the pride, he will go through and kill all the cubs that are
Yep.
in the pride so that he can have his own.
Mm-hmm.
And the lionesses basically just let this happen. Now, we would look at that and recoil in horror, right? Like, oh, that's terrible, right? But we're not lions. Okay, do you think lions, if I were a lion, would I consider that to be evil? Maybe not.
Mm.
Right? So it's really
Yeah.
hard to think about this from getting outside of the head of the human. So that means, though, that when we recoil from that, it's for a very good reason, right? That's an instinctive action as well, right? So it might be an instinct to attack. Then there's another instinct that says, but not too much.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we're the balancing act. We don't create this stuff. We have to sort it out, though. So that's our job. All right. So again, this is what we're doing here. We're trying to do this. I want a culture that's humane and realistic, that accounts for biological differences, whatever they are, rather than simply assume that the differences can be changed. Okay, that's a big piece of this. Because number one, I have to identify that the differences exist before I can say anything about them. But then let's say that we do recognize them, and we say, this is coming from our biology. This is something that we can't really change. That is an entirely different conversation than, here's these differences, and it's all due to culture and learning that is, by definition, malleable. Well, then let's malleable it. Let's fix it, right? Let's change it. So then if my first assumption was correct, though, the second work is going to be inhumane, because I'm going to be trying to shove square pegs into round holes. And I'm going to cause all kinds of angst and anguish. If, on the other hand, I look at the first and if I'm correct about the first option, then I'm going to say, okay, given that we know that this is a thing, how do we work within the boundaries that we have? How can we operate on that in a humane manner? All right. Okay. So then the proposed psychological differences. Okay. So let's look at a common stereotype is that men are more aggressive and competitive than women. Okay. That's a common stereotype that's thrown out there. If I'm going to ask myself, okay, is that stereotype, is that due to a genuine difference in the sexes, or is it not? How am I going to answer that question? One thing I could do is I could get on YouTube and listen to a whole bunch of people screaming about it. Or I might do something more constructive, which is look at what the research says about this stuff. Okay. Okay, and it turns out the research says, you know what, this is not actually an easy question to tease out, but here's our best guess. This is coming from an article by Jonathan Archer, who has done a lot of research on this. It's a 2019 article called The Reality and Evolutionary Significance of Human Psychological Sex Differences. It's from a review, an article called from the Biological Reviews of the Cambridge Philosophical Society. I can provide that in the description for anyone who's interested. It's not unique to this one paper. What I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be skipping around and doing some other stuff too, but a lot of this section here is going to be from this article. And I can tell we're going to run out of time before I get through it, but here we go.
It's all right.
It's okay. So number one is, these are the questions we need to ask if we're going to say this is a difference in the sexes. One, is there a plausible, testable adaptive explanation? For example, before, male elephant seals are bigger because it's adaptive. They get access to more mates if they are bigger and they can clobber the other ones. Two, is there a similar difference in other mammals, especially the apes? Now, we're not talking about size differences here. We're talking about psychological differences. Okay, I just use that as an example. If we say for example, we make the observation that let's not use aggressiveness. Let's use violent. Let's say men are more violent than women. Is there a testable adaptive explanation? Yes. It could be that violence leads to better reproductive success, and it has over the past, several million years in the human and hominid evolution. Is there a similar difference in mammals, especially the apes? Yeah. Male apes are more violent than female apes. Is there a difference found cross-culturally? So now I'm saying, do I observe more violent males in more than just our culture? Do I see it around the world in many cultures? Doesn't have to be 100%, because there are circumstances that would preclude this, like the Maori that we talked about before. And I think generally the answer to this is, yeah, probably. Without having all the data in front of me, I can't say for sure. But if I was a betting man, I would say, does this difference begin early in life? All right, again, we're going for a biological origin for this. So it needs to have biological connections. And if it is biological, then you would expect it naturally to emerge at least pretty early. At the latest, young adulthood. Why? Because that's when reproduction is most intense in young adulthood. So it better be there before then, or else we're going to have to give up on an evolutionary explanation. If men in their 50s were more violent than everybody else, then that would not be explainable from biological point of view, unless you could somehow explain how that helped them reproduce after they've already, sure, men in their 50s reproduce, but you know what I mean. Is this difference correlated with neonatal or pubertal hormones? Okay, so even individuals who are not male, but may have a particular condition, like adrenal hyperplasia, for example, where they have more testosterone in their system, if we're going with a biological explanation, it needs a biological mechanism. Testosterone is an easy target. It's a low-hanging fruit there, no pun intended. And you go from that to a higher increase in violent behavior. If you see that, then that's another, piece of the evidence. And then the sixth one is, can you find evolutionary derived design features in the mechanism? So in other words, does the violence appear to serve an evolutionary adaptive mechanism, meaning that I am going to be violent towards those whom I am directly competing for reproductive access, or a stand-in for it? For example, if females value money, that's another stereotype, and success, then males would naturally gravitate towards competing over money and success to indirectly get reproductive success. If I don't have all six of those suckers, then I don't have a great biological explanation for the difference that I see. I'm going to have to look elsewhere. Okay, seems reasonable. In Archer's analysis, he he went over 178 different studies and looked at all of those criteria for a slew of different observations in psychological differences, not only behavior, but cognition. And he used a statistical method we don't need to get into to rank them between 0 and 4. So 0 being no observed difference in the sexes, 4 being a very large difference in sexes, 2 being a modest difference observed. And any observed difference, right? So if the further up you go on the scale, then the more the observed difference appeared to be adaptive, observed in other mammals, found cross-culturally, manifested early, correlated with hormonal levels, either neonatal or pubertal, and seem to have adaptive design features. All right, we're just going to go over. I don't care.
Let's do it.
We got to get into this. I can't just leave.
Yeah, I got time, man. I got all the time.
All right, that's being too much of a cliffhanger. All right, so let me just we'll make this more dialectic here. I'm doing all the talking.
No, please do.
Okay, so let's look at anger. Anger, just the physical experience of anger. Where would you guess it's between 0 and 4?
Mm-hmm.
What would you guess?
In terms of the differences between men and women?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anger. Well, I think like the experience of anger is probably very similar, but how it's actually expressed
that's a different
is very different.
Yes. So your intuition is right. It's 0. There's no observed difference in men and women in terms of whether or not they feel anger.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, physical aggression, on the other hand, is more what you're alluding to. Yeah, I might be angry, but I won't necessarily do anything physical about it. I might do something else about it. I might do something socially about it, or verbally, or whatever. Okay, so physical aggression measures at a 2. So there's a moderate difference that on all these scales, males tend to be more physically aggressive. Weapon use is a 3. So if I'm going to be physically aggressive, I may bust out a weapon or a stick or something, and males are a lot more likely to use a weapon than a woman is. And then violent crimes measures at a 4.
Yeah.
So the proposed difference before that we were saying, is this biological? It does look like it is. Okay, now let me step back for a second. What does this mean? Does this mean that all men are more violent than all women? No, it does not mean that. Because these are statistical differences. Okay, so that means that we have a bimodal curve, essentially. Along any sort of behavioral measure, there's going to be a cluster, a spike in frequency, and then another one when you get to the other gender, right? So you got the male, like the male is going to be here, the female is going to be here in terms of violence. You're going to see something like this, whereas with anger, it should be like this. It's more of a normal curve here. Now, that means that there are a few females that are violent about as much as the average male, and vice versa. There's going to be a lot of non-violent, or not a lot, but there's going to be some non-violent men that fit more into the female, thing. So it's important to remember the overlap here, because people want to take this stuff and then apply it to themselves and say, I'm supposed to be this way because that's the statistical norms say that. No. Where this comes into play, though, is in our cultural expressions and our ideals. And I think that it's easy to use this sloppily and clumsily to create and craft a model of masculinity that is incomplete and stupid. Okay, just to be blunt. Rather, we need to be more realistic and more nuanced about this. Okay.
Yeah.
This is all still therefore important, though. If we know that there is a stronger tendency towards violent crime in males rather than females, the question of what we do with that information is a cultural one. And to me, it looks like that means that we should value self-control and discipline, and that we need to instill that in men in terms of this particular aspect in order to keep this at a minimum. Right? We need to try to do that, which is, of course, what a lot of military institutions do. They don't make a difference between men and women in this respect, but it means that I think on average, men might have more difficulty with that than women because of this dichotomy here. Any given male, for example, statistically speaking, will have a slightly higher likelihood of acting on this.
Right.
And that because we've gone through this and we've separated out the biological contributor to this, we can look at that and say that's the piece here that we have to be aware of, but we're not going to be able to really change until we change the genome. And doing that is kind of a scary thought. That seems like it's a bad idea. It's sort of like, let's just introduce this invasive species into a new ecosystem for the lulz. Oh, it'll be fine.
Yeah. Let's confine a species that's used to yards upon yards and miles upon miles of open space, and just gather them all up and put them into one confined, place, and then see what happens.
Right. Yeah. For all this stuff about alpha males comes from is that.
Yeah. Well, I as you were talking, I think what I'm hearing is the propensity or the potential for this. Not only it's biologically true, but it's also psychologically relevant in terms of the potential of these actions actually happening. And the best of the best in terms of culture, which is an extension of that, means that you realize the potential and you create certain systems for some level of an outlet, right?
Yeah.
Like boys are more prone to violent play than girls are. If a female chimp is given a doll, she'll play with it. If a male chimp, a young male chimp, is given a doll, he'll just start smacking it everywhere and throwing it at his buddies, right? So, but it doesn't mean that they don't also care and aren't taught to care, right? But it's again, like there is a real difference in expression, and you have to look at the potentials there.
Right. And if we look at all boys and all girls as identically, are all exactly the same, and we just need to give them the cookie cutter, it's not going to be efficient.
Right.
Because we're either going to miss out on things that girls need, or we're going to miss out on things that boys need. And this, again, this is downstream from all this that we're going to get.
Right. Yeah.
But I mean, you can see immediately where the stuff gets political, it gets very intense. Because as soon as we look at this, we're starting to think about, okay, where are the resources going? Oh, suddenly we're political. Who gets the power? Okay, now we're political. So it's very tough. And I would say it's impossible to separate the politics out of this. We just need to be aware of it and be able to track it as best we can. Violent video games. I don't think it takes a genius to figure this one out, right? It's a 4. Males are much more interested in playing violent video games than women are. Now, I don't know how they measure this cross-culturally. Like, they don't have Xboxes in the, Amazon, but anyway, that's the data they have there. Forgiveness. What do you think? Forgiveness. Yeah. Is there a difference? And if so, what might it be?
I think there's maybe not so much of a difference, but a difference of expression.
Okay.
Potentially.
And they didn't look at that. They were looking more at just a tendency to think about forgiveness. And there's really not much difference, honestly, which is kind of interesting. The stereotype is that men are maybe more hard asses than women, or you could go the other way and say, hell hath no fury, right? But honestly, that one measured at a 1, so not a big difference in favor of females. Females might be a little bit more, but not a huge difference there. Revenge, however, is a 3 in favor of males. Okay. And that's one that you can see throughout history. If you didn't take revenge, you got clobbered. We talked about that in the Beowulf video. Beowulf's going to come up later, right? He's waiting on his throne. He's like, I dealt with the dragon. Now what else you got for me?
Yeah, right.
I'm about to come down there and teach you some things. Social dominance, interestingly enough, is a 2. I would have expected that to be a 4, but then after reflection on it, it's like, well, but women are concerned about that too. It may not have as big of an impact on reproductive success as a male that could potentially have multiple, partners in a short period of time, but that successfully reproduced. But it's there. So it's a moderate difference in that sense. Okay, so I've given our 3 audience members a taste. There's a ton more of this stuff, a ton, and I will have to wrap it up here. But so this is where we're going to start. This is where we're going to go. Just for like future reference, I want to take us through all of these, and then get into, once we figured this out and we're able to see these are the differences, these are what science is showing us. What do we do about it?
Yeah.
Or what do we do about it? There's a lot of internet gurus and all these people out there that are making very vague statements about what masculinity is. And what I've noticed is we don't have a real clear idea of exactly what does this concept mean? Number one, like, what is it? Is it an idea? A concept? Well, if it is, it's a concept that seems to be based on biological data. So it's not just a concept, an airy metaphor or anything. It's something. There's some substance to it. What? So that's where we're headed.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing assessment, sir. Like, seriously, like, I think that you did a phenomenal job of just laying the foundation. Because we can get into the guru stuff later on, but there are a lot.
We will need to, because there's a reason why I think there's this craving for this in our culture, especially. And that's a lot of the meat and potatoes here too, but we can't do anything with that until we say, here's our starting point, our anchor. Fact, scientific fact, right? Biology. And people get upset about that, and it's for valid reasons, because people are afraid that biology is going to be misused. But we address this all the time, right? We're always looking at this and saying, yes, we need to make sure we're not misusing this data and saying, here's a great reason to oppress women again. Like, wow, that's awesome, yippee, or let's be racist assholes, and all that. Right. It's like, no, there is no justification for any of that garbage. So yeah.
All right, here we are.
All right, that's the end of part 1.
All right.
Stay tuned for later.
All right, see you later, Dr. G. Thank you.
All right.
Bye, guys.